many, many thanks to Georg and to Tanya and to anyone who's been involved in organising this. It's a treat for me to be back in UAE. I lived and worked here for 2 years, so it's very exciting. And yeah, this won't really be a climax to the day, more hopefully a kind of soothing warm down. As I know a lot of people have, equal or greater jet lag than I do, so this isn't going to be like a research. I'm not going to give you any fancy philosophical arguments or research. It's more just my, biased view of the landscape, something like that, right? So I want to talk about two connected topics, right? Firstly, the possibility that AI devices could maybe in the future have some form of consciousness, and the possibility that such devices might have some kind of moral status. That is, they might be worthy of our ethical consideration, or rights, or something like that, moral rights. And the topics are obviously connected insofar as it seems very, very plausible that having consciousness entails having some kind of moral status, right? It's no exaggeration to say that, conscious experience is kind of, at least one of, perhaps the most fundamental and important sources of value and meaning in the world, right? In a world without consciousness, it's plausible there'd be no kind of value or meaning of any kind. But despite the kind of obvious centrality and importance of consciousness to our lives, as a bunch of other speakers have already mentioned, we don't really have any kind of solid theoretical grasp on what consciousness is, nor on what morality is, or ethics is for that matter. So despite learning more and more about the structure of the brain in recent decades, there's still no kind of theoretical consensus about the nature or physical basis of consciousness, or even its function. And I guess the situation in ethics is the same. Thousands of years of philosophy has produced a bunch of theories, but no kind of consensus, right? So we find ourselves in a situation where we kind of lack the theoretical tools to answer crucially important questions concerning consciousness and morality. And I guess this is kind of similar to the situation we're in with non-human animal minds and non-human animal consciousness, right? It's clearly vitally important to know if we're causing animals suffering and how much suffering they have in order to work out what moral obligations we have to them. But of course the situation is probably worse when it comes to machine consciousness because we don't even have the shared biology or at least similar evolutionary history that might be at least some kind of evidence about similar conscious experiences, right? Okay, so let me just say a tiny bit about consciousness. So philosophers like to use this phrase phenomenal consciousness, which really is just to emphasize that we're talking about consciousness that has a specific phenomenology, a specific way things feel or appear to you. So, the way a red visual sensation looks is different to how a blue sensation looks, of course. A migraine headache feels subtly different to a hungover headache. That kind of stuff, right? So a phrase that's commonly used, that's Thomas Nagel, his famous 1974 paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat. Supposed to get this sense of a subjective perspective that has a particular qualitative nature. Something like that. And of course it's phenomenal consciousness that can be pleasant or painful and that can make life worth living or make it an unendurable torment. Not all phenomenal consciousness needs to be good or bad. Of course, you could have just kind of neutral phenomenal consciousness. Now, of course, again, a lot of people have mentioned this already, the big philosophical or conceptual mystery about consciousness is how exactly it's related to the physical world and in particular to the physical brain and the nervous system. Of course, we know that the brain is intimately connected with consciousness. There's endlessly many experiments being carried out to find out exactly what kinds of neural activity are correlated with which kinds of mental activities and tasks. But despite all these advances in neuroscience, the central kind of theoretical or conceptual problem remains how exactly does the electrical activity in the brain, in this lump of grey matter, give rise to the various phenomenal properties that we know and love from our own first-personal introspective perspective, right? We've had a lot of people talk about, Dave Chalmers uses the phrase hard problem of consciousness, Joe Levine talks about the explanatory gap. A bunch of people have explained this very nicely already. I'll just say, from the third personal point of view, just observing the physical brain and the patterns of electrical activity in it, there doesn't seem to be anything remotely there like whatever, the smell of cut grass or the taste of coffee or the feeling when you hit your funny bone, right? All these specific phenomenal qualities. Of course, if you ask a conscious subject how they're feeling, you can get correlations. But the problem remains, why should that specific pattern of neural activity give rise to this specific phenomenal quality rather than some other phenomenal quality, or indeed no phenomenal qualities whatsoever? I mean, another way of putting that is just to say, even if it's true that consciousness is just identical to some physical process in the brain, we still don't really understand how it could be true, right? I mean, what does it even mean to say that a quality of my first personal subjective experience that no one else can experience for themselves is identical to a pattern of neural firings in a lump of grey matter in physical space? Anyway, you could say much, much more about this. Philosophers go on and on about it. I've spent an awful lot of my adult life blathering on about it. But in addition to the kind of, you might call philosophical or metaphysical confusion, there's also a lack of scientific consensus, right? We don't even have any kind of settled view on what kinds of processes or structures in the brain are responsible for consciousness, right? What kind of neural activity. People talk about generating consciousness, which is a slightly slippery way of talking. Anyway, the point is just that there's many, many different candidate theories, but none of them have gained widespread acceptance, right? So just very briefly, back in the 90s, there was the Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner, and Christoph Koch talked about 40 hertz oscillations, these patterns that cycle 40 times a second of neural activity, but that's kind of gone out of fashion. More recently, there was Giulio Tononi on the right. He has this integrated information theory. That promised to give a kind of mathematical measure of degrees of consciousness. You can have more or less consciousness measured in terms of Shannon information. Again, that made some waves, but no one much believes it anymore. I'm very sympathetic to this middle one, the global workspace theory. It's associated with Bernard Bars and Stanislas Dehaene, the neuroscientists, and the great philosopher Dan Dennett in the middle there, looking like Santa Claus. Dennett has this nice phrase that consciousness is fame in the brain, right? This idea that representations win a kind of popularity contest amongst competing systems in the brain, and that's what makes them enter into consciousness. There's also higher order representations. That has the nice idea that consciousness always involves self-consciousness, which some people find a kind of plausible idea. What makes a representation enter into consciousness is that it's represented by a higher order one, a meta-representation. And then, as we heard in the excellent talk this morning, we also have quantum mechanical views, right? I mean, it certainly wouldn't say it's the mainstream view yet, but there are all sorts of extremely smart people, like Roger Penrose and Professor Otter, who are advocating for this kind of stuff. Anyway, the point is just to give you a sense of the widespread disagreement, right? I mean, the situation isn't any better in ethics, right? It's not like there's widespread agreement about what makes an action good or bad or right or wrong in ethics either. I mean, what I wanted to talk about is a slightly different question, which is what makes something worthy of moral consideration, right? What explains why some things and not others are worthy of having a moral status? So whatever, a table or a chair or a rock or a puddle of water has no intrinsic moral status, but humans do and animals do. And what makes the difference, right? So here are some kind of obvious possible suggestions you might think of. Well, maybe it's being alive, right? That's what gives you moral status. Maybe it's having a mind. Maybe it's having a conscious mind. Maybe it's having the ability to consciously suffer, right? Some philosophers like to talk about the ability to respond to reasons, right? Rational reasons, moral reasons. Now, I mean, I think it's pretty, at least non-obvious that any of those could be necessary conditions for having moral status, right? For example, you might think maybe plants. You think of a nice old olive tree, 500-year-old olive tree or a giant sequoia or something. Maybe that has an intrinsic moral status despite having no kind of mind, right? You might think maybe, dead people have moral rights and moral status even though they're not alive and don't have minds anymore. Maybe future unborn generations have moral status, right, despite not meeting any of these. But so even if none of them are necessary conditions, I think it's pretty plausible that having consciousness is a sufficient condition, right? That's to say, if you have some degree or kind of phenomenal consciousness, then you have at least some kind of moral status, right? I'm not really giving you an argument for that. It just strikes me as immensely, immensely plausible, right? It would be wrong to, for no reason whatever, just snuff out a conscious perspective on the world, right? In the way it just wouldn't be morally wrong to destroy a table or a chair or a rock or a puddle of water. Right? Now notice, of course, I've been talking about some kind or some degree of moral status, and so I'm assuming that there are such things as kind of different levels or different degrees of moral status. Again, I take it that's pretty plausible, though I'm not giving you an argument for it, it's just a natural way we seem to think of these things. Almost everyone thinks that non-human animals have some kind of moral status, but that it's less than ours. Of course, you can argue about how to measure these things, or which kind of species gets which kind of moral status, right? But almost everyone's going to agree that a goldfish or a mouse has a lower moral status than a human, right? And if we start to consider why it is that we think that some species are more kind of morally valuable or have a high moral status, it's just very, very hard to avoid the conclusion that it's very closely connected to mental complexity and mental richness, right? So, I don't know. Suppose that we decoded dolphin song, right? By the way, they're using machine learning to try and do that at the moment, right? But suppose it turns out that actually dolphins have a language with a recursive syntax, and they can do logical deductions, and they can plan for the future, and they're having all these cool conversations, right? I think it's immediately obvious that we would have to raise their moral status to near human level, right? It would just be a completely irresistible argument, right? Yeah, I mean, it may not be the only factor that's important to moral status, but it's surely one very, very important factor, is the degree and richness and complexity of the animals or the species' mental life, right? Okay, so, I mean, whenever you're uncertain about some possible danger or threat, you obviously face the question of how much you should worry about it, right? How much time and resources should you devote to thinking about a mere possibility? Well, that's obviously going to depend on two things, right? How likely is the possibility, and how bad would it be? How important would it be if it happened, right? So, in the case of machine consciousness, I mean, there have been many theorists who kind of dismiss it as a sci-fi fantasy, or as something that's too unlikely to take place in the kind of near to mid-term future. We've got a bunch of other things we should be worrying about. We should be concentrating on the environment, maybe, or all sorts of other things, right? But so I guess I basically just want to suggest that there's good reasons to at least think that the possibility of machine consciousness has a high enough probability to be worth thinking about and worrying about. And I guess that's what I'm hoping to convince you of today. Right? So firstly, right, well, just as a general point, given that we have no good theoretical grip on what consciousness is or its physical basis, we should at least allow that it's a live possibility, that in the not too distant future, machines generate some degree of consciousness, right? And bear in mind, that may not be as rich and complex as humans, right? Maybe it's something like a mouse or a goldfish or something like that, right? But still, it would be important to think about in terms of ethics. It's still wrong to just, torture a mouse or torture a goldfish, right? And of course, even without any deliberate intention on the part of the designers, there's a possibility that we might create machine consciousness unwittingly, right? Just as a byproduct of creating devices with various functional capabilities. So if you make a robot that can perceive and has drives and can move about its environment, I think you should take seriously the possibility that it has a degree of consciousness comparable to an animal that can do the same kind of things. Right? Secondly, there exists a whole field of clever researchers and groups who are very actively and deliberately trying to create machine consciousness. We have one present today, right? So they had journals devoted to this kind of thing, right? Now, of course, maybe that whole field is chasing a fantasy, right? I mean, I don't want to prejudge that issue. But nevertheless, the existence of this genre of research with all these clever computer scientists and neuroscientists should at least give us pause to think that it has a non-trivial possibility of occurring in the near to mid future, right? Thirdly, so I just wanted to mention a couple of more specific areas of kind of current active research that I think are kind of, well, you might think it's plausible, are especially likely to create machine consciousness, and which are both kind of modeled very closely on the human brain, right? So firstly, this whole brain computer emulation or simulation, and secondly, this brain-computer interface technology, right, where non-biological components are inserted to interact with the brain or replace parts of the biological brain. So taking the whole brain emulation first, so there's a bunch, as the previous talk mentioned, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different research groups who are working on building ever more accurate computer simulations. I mean, one particularly eye-catching project is in Japan. They used the vast computational power of the K supercomputer to model the human cerebellum. The cerebellum contains 80% of the neurons in the human brain. So this computer simulation modeled 68 billion neurons performing complex spiking patterns, right? It basically just simulated a brain just for a few seconds as it performed something called the optokinetic reflex, which is just basically a saccade that the eye does. Like, if you're tracking something and then it moves out of your field of vision, your eye goes back to where it started from, right? That's the optokinetic reflex. So that's what they were modeling. And the Japanese team reported that the model reproduced plausible neuronal activity patterns that are observed experimentally in animals, right? So the simulation ran 576 times slower than a real-life human brain does in real time, right? But anyway, they claim that the K computer is already capable of creating a simulation of a human-scale cerebellar model, right? And so the obvious kind of endpoint of this genre of research is to achieve a perfect one-for-one model, right? Neuron-for-neuron model for an entire brain. And of course all the connections, right? You've got to model all the connections too. So a recent survey article by some of the Japanese neuroscientists who were working on this said, computer simulation of the human brain at an individual neuron resolution is an ultimate goal of computational neuroscience, right? So again, this is something we should take seriously, right? It's happening there, huge amounts of resources devoted to it. I just had this picture of the K supercomputer looking awesome, right, with all the banks stretching to infinity there. So, you know, apparently it's the fourth fastest in the world, or it was at the time. I mean, there's obviously a whole range of motivations for trying to achieve this kind of perfect brain simulation. I should say, right, they talk of brain emulation is the idea that it's not just a simulation, right, it's literally emulating the brain. Again, people have already mentioned it would allow for an incredible amount of experimentation and advances in medical science, as you can test how a brain breaks down and how it might be fixed again. But even partial models of parts of the brain, once we understand how they function in cognitive tasks, you can then use them to design all sorts of useful AI devices, plausibly, right? You could do pattern recognition and speech recognition and stuff like that. Slightly more speculatively, right? And this is perhaps now entering more sci-fi kind of territory, right? If whole brain simulations could be produced commercially, you then open up the possibility of creating artificial workers, artificial people. Obviously, the consequences of that would be totally radical and transformative, and raise all sorts of difficult ethical questions. If you could model a specific human brain, right, not just a generic human brain, but my specific human brain, well, that would open up the possibility of duplicating my own, brain, I should say, which I could then use as a backup and potentially make myself immortal or something like that. Right? Finally, of course, if it's possible to create a whole brain simulation or emulation, it's very plausible you could then start tweaking with some of the variables to increase the cognitive performance to greater than human levels, right? Which, of course, is one plausible route to an AI intelligence explosion or singularity. Now, of course, there will be some theorists who deny that even a perfect neuron-for-neuron simulation would allow for, would make something that's really conscious. People like John Searle, who are impressed by the Chinese room argument, would just say, well, it's just a mere simulation, right? It doesn't really have any intelligence or any understanding or any consciousness whatsoever, right? It's just a model. I don't want to get into that debate. For what it's worth, I think Searle's argument is terrible and that he's not a very nice person. I also think it's just totally implausible that there's some magic ingredient in the specific biochemistry of the brain that silicon somehow lacks. But anyway, whether you agree with that or not, I think everyone should have enough intellectual humility to admit that in the present state of understanding, we just don't know what's essential for consciousness. Nobody knows, right? And so if a perfect neuron-for-neuron simulation of a whole human brain was created, I think all sides in the debate should admit they just wouldn't know for sure if it was conscious or not, but they should at least take it pretty seriously. Like, really seriously, as a possibility, right? Frankly, I think even the most skeptical, even Searle himself, right, if you hooked this simulation up to a speech synthesizer and you could hear the brain reporting on its experiences and begging for the painful stimulus to stop, you could hear it howling in pain, I think even John Searle would have to admit, yeah, okay, it's a pretty live possibility, it's conscious. Right? So the other kind of technology I just wanted to mention is brain-computer interface technology. This is being pursued very actively by Elon Musk's Neuralink company. There are other companies like Neurable and BitBrain. It's also being very heavily funded by DARPA, the US Defense Agency research agency. But so, I mean, BCI technology can either be invasive or non-invasive, right? In the non-invasive one, they just put EEG sensors on your head and monitor the brain activity that way, and then you can use that to, whatever, control a cursor on the screen or control a robotic arm or whatever. But then there's the invasive version where they literally put the stuff directly inside your skull to interface with individual neurons, right? So that's a picture of one particular version and that come out of UC Berkeley, which they call neural dust, right? So, and then here it is attached to a neuron in a rat, right? It's roughly the size of a grain of sand, and it can do very precisely timed electrical charges to stimulate it. Here, you guys might have seen this, but this is a 9-year-old macaque who's successfully playing the classic video game Pong just by thinking about moving her arm and her hand, right? So the metal straw is just giving her banana smoothie, which is the reward the monkey gets, right? So they can successfully control this and successfully play Pong. So, again, I think this technology, we should at least think that it's, gradually replacing more and more of the biological brain with artificial components that are functionally similar or equivalent is one other obvious path to machine consciousness that we should treat as a serious possibility, right? Again, there's a whole bunch of philosophical questions here, right? How could we be sure that it's really generating consciousness, right? Even if the person's reporting consciousness, should we trust them, right? Would it even be the same person? There's issues about personal identity. Would they even be human, right? All very interesting stuff. But anyway, I just wanted to mention those as clear examples of actual current fields of research that I think, plausibly in the not too distant future might achieve something like machine consciousness, right? Of course, both of those are modeled very, very closely on the human brain, right? But okay, so I hope I've kind of convinced you that machine consciousness is at least something you should treat as a live possibility, right? Given it has kind of obviously important practical and ethical consequences, but given that we lack any settled theory of it, the question is, well, how could we even test, or how could we even get evidence whether a device is conscious or not, right? We won't have a definitive test, of course, because we don't have a solid theory, but still there might be kind of clues, right? You might think there might be non-decisive evidence for or against the presence of machine consciousness, right? I mean, in the case of whole brain emulation, there's obviously this like perfect functional structural similarity, and you could have a speech synthesizer hooked up, so the emulation could be describing its apparent experiences. So that's a kind of particularly good case, right? But I guess the harder, more interesting question concerns the evidence you might have for or against the presence of consciousness in devices that aren't just perfectly simulating the human brain, right? I mean, the human brain's kind of the one thing in the world that we know for sure has consciousness, right? So, as far as I can see, I think there's really just kind of two kinds of evidence, right? Firstly, you could look at the internal functioning of the device and think whether it's suitable for producing consciousness according to one or more of the currently disputed theories of consciousness that we have, right? So, of course, that's only going to be pretty weak evidence insofar as nobody believes any of these theories, right? But if the device's internal functioning counts as suitable for sustaining consciousness according to lots of those theories, well, now maybe the evidence becomes a bit more plausible, a bit more convincing, right? So that's one kind of evidence. The other kind, the only other real kind of evidence we have is the behavior, that's linguistic or non-linguistic behavior, of the device. Is it the kind of thing that expresses consciousness? And so here, there are at least two reasons why we need to be very, very cautious in how we handle this kind of evidence. Firstly, humans have this tendency to anthropomorphize things and see mentality and see intentions in things that lack a mind altogether. We had somebody talk about, right from the start, we had Wiesenbaum's ELIZA program, right? There's lots of studies about how easily humans are fooled by chatbots and how easily you project emotions onto robots with cute faces and that kind of stuff, right? But secondly, there's the possibility that consciousness in AI devices is just associated with totally different forms of behavior than it is in humans or non-human animals, right? Or indeed with no kind of outward behavior at all, right? And of course, there's the possibility that machine consciousness is very alien, right, and is utterly different to anything we can imagine. Sorry, which slide am I on? So just thinking about linguistic behavior, right? I mean, if an AI device can communicate in language, an obvious kind of sign or evidence of machine consciousness is if the device starts talking about consciousness, indeed starts talking about its own experiences, right? Now, of course, there's the very live possibility that the device is just fluently faking, right? Already the most sophisticated natural language processing things like GPT-3 can probably produce lots of quite plausible text describing pains and describing the smell of cut grass or whatever it is. And, you know, it would be pretty fluent for the first couple of paragraphs until you eventually begin to suspect that something's off, right? But so this kind of linguistic evidence can be strengthened if the device in question has been insulated, or as they sometimes put it, sandboxed, right? So that it's been denied access to the internet and it's been denied access to human linguistic data, right? So if the device has been insulated in that way, it kind of rules out the hypothesis that this is all just kind of fluent parroting and faking, right? So Susan Schneider here, she's got a very nice example of, like, you ask an AI device if it can understand the switches of conscious perspective that occur in the film Freaky Friday, right? So this is effectively a kind of Turing test focused on consciousness, right? If this kind of insulated device starts talking about consciousness in fluent, coherent ways, I think that would be quite strong evidence, or at least some kind of evidence, right? So there's a classic Asimov story, right, where the robot starts describing its dreams, right, to the surprise of its creators. More generally, if an AI device kind of coins or comes up with concepts of consciousness off its own bat, right, again, I think that's pretty interesting, significant evidence. What about non-linguistic behavior? Well, obviously, there's all sorts of forms of behavior in animals and humans that we take to express various conscious experiences. You can scream in pain, you can laugh, you can blush, you can shake with fear, you can seek out your mummy for comfort, right? You can grieve the death of a loved one. I guess if a device were to start exhibiting some of those non-linguistic behaviors, it might be taken as evidence of consciousness. Again, there's this huge difficulty that all these things can be faked, right, if there's an incentive to fake them. So again, you can strengthen this kind of evidence if we know that the device has been not deliberately engineered or has not just kind of picked up by copying or parroting these behaviors, right, from data in a training set. I think I'll skip a couple of slides because I will take too long otherwise. And I'll just cut to the chase. So I've claimed that we should treat the possibility of some form of machine consciousness in the near future as at least having a significant probability. And I've also claimed that we'll probably, at best, have very, very weak evidence. You know, at best, we might have hints and suggestive clues, but we'll have nothing definitive. And so the question then is, well, what to do about this situation? And I guess, really, the only thing we can do is be extremely cautious, it seems to me, right? I mean, in the context of the environmental crisis, philosophers often talk about the precautionary principle. Philosophers often disagree about how you might state that precisely or formalize it. I think that's kind of silly. It's just a totally obvious, sensible idea that if an action has a possible side effect or consequence that would be totally catastrophic, like the end of the human race, then of course you should be pretty careful about performing that action, right? So what are the potentially catastrophic consequences associated with machine consciousness? Well, I think there's dangers both ways here, right? So there's a danger that we fail to attribute consciousness to devices that do in fact possess it to some degree. You could call that the false negative danger, right? So that could happen given how weak and inconclusive our possible evidence for machine consciousness is, right? Given the possibility that machine consciousness might first arise in a kind of simple primitive form without us even realizing. And then, of course, the danger is that we'll end up treating something which has a conscious view as a mere object, right? We'll just destroy them as we pick. We'll be ignoring their desires, ignoring their suffering, and so on. And that situation would clearly be ethically disastrous, and arguably it's pretty similar to the kind of ethically disastrous situation you get with, say, battery farmed hens, right? It would be worse, of course, depending on how rich and sophisticated the machine consciousness is, but also how widespread it is, right? And I think that's partly why people like Nick Bostrom worry about it so much, is that there's the possibility you could very rapidly copy algorithms, right, onto loads and loads of computers and run them simultaneously. So a bunch of people have warned of a potential astronomical amount of suffering being created without us even realizing, right? There's also the converse danger that we do attribute consciousness to devices that in fact lack it. They're just mere unconscious automata. We call that the false positive. Again, that's quite plausible given our tendency to anthropomorphize and to. There's also all these commercial pressures to create cute, lifelike devices. And that would also be bad because then we'd start mistakenly and pointlessly devoting our limited resources to protecting machines, right? Giving them legal rights and protections and worrying about them being destroyed. And of course that means that there's less resources and less freedom for the actual real humans who really are conscious. I mean, I guess of those two dangers, it's the first one that seems worse, right? But still, they're both bad, right? They'd both be bad outcomes. What would being cautious amount to in the case of AI and machine consciousness? Well, I guess the kind of extreme option is, and this has been advocated by Thomas Metzinger recently and other people, a total moratorium on research that aims or risks creating machine consciousness. So he says up until 2050 there should be a global moratorium on synthetic phenomenology, strictly banning all research that directly aims at or knowingly risks the emergence of artificial consciousness. I mean, maybe. It just strikes me as it's not going to happen, right? That just strikes me as too infeasible. Given mankind's or humankind's inability to take global coordinated action on anything, right, even the environmental crisis, I mean, it's just not going to happen anytime soon. Right? There's also just still the risk that we create machine consciousness inadvertently, right, without intending to. Right? So it's kind of less extreme options. Well, you might require ethical approval or governmental oversight for research that might create machine consciousness. There's also the idea of developing standardized laboratory protocols that minimize the risk of machine consciousness or machine suffering. So a couple of guys from the University of Utah there have already developed a kind of 5-step protocol for the ethical treatment of AI. You might also think of kind of political or legislative actions. I mean, one obvious possibility is granting legal rights to devices that are potentially conscious, right? And there have been, policymakers in various countries have already started thinking about this. I mean, I won't read it all out. In particular, that last one, in 2017, the European Parliament passed this resolution suggesting a specific legal status for robots in the long run, so that at least the most sophisticated autonomous robots could be established as having the status of electronic persons, right? There's also, I mean, this is, I guess, kind of funny, but there are also these organizations in America advocating for the rights of robots. I can't take that very seriously. Anyway, I just thought I'd put it up there. So I've tried to be kind of sensible and sober so far in the talk, but the last slide or two I'm going to allow myself to be a bit more speculative. So I mean, there's been an awful lot of recent work considering how human ethical values might be instilled into the behavior of autonomous devices, self-driving cars, all sorts of things, right? And maybe we should kind of hardwire ethical principles into these things, like Asimov's laws of robotics. Maybe we should try and get them to learn our values and principles. That's been the suggestion of Stuart Russell and many other people. And it seems that machine consciousness has both a potential positive and a potential negative side here. So on the one hand, it's not implausible to think that consciousness is a vital part of empathy, a vital part of sympathy, and that those in turn are vital for having genuine moral understanding, right? So, yeah, there's at least the possibility that having machine consciousness could actually improve our future prospects of having autonomous AI devices that have human interests at heart and have something like understanding of human morality, right? On the other hand, it's also plausible to think that consciousness might make, controlling and predicting autonomous devices more difficult, right? And I mean that in both a practical and also an ethical sense, right? So in the practical sense, the worry is just that machines with consciousness might, develop emotions or might start dreaming or whatever, and this would make their behavior unpredictable and make them hard to control. That's the plot of like every sci-fi film ever, right? But also at an ethical level, I think there are difficult questions about the extent to which it would be morally permissible to create a conscious device that, for example, happily commits suicide just to save me 5 minutes inconvenience, right? Even if it didn't cause it pain, you might still think there's something morally objectionable about that, right? I guess that's something like the plot of the new Ishiguro novel, Clara and the Sun, if you guys have read that. I'd recommend it. Even more speculatively, singularity, right? I don't know how seriously to take this kind of thing. It is being taken much more and more seriously. I should just say, by singularity, I mean an intelligence explosion in the sense that I.J. Good and Werner Winchman, I'm not talking about transhumanism here, right? I just mean an explosion of intelligence, right? Were such an event to occur, the prospects for humanity's long-term existence starts looking pretty dim, right? So if we are taking this scenario seriously, well, this kind of transhumanist idea that you should somehow upload yourself or merge with a machine, maybe it's the least bad option, right? But of course, then the question of whether these hypothetical superintelligent devices are conscious or not becomes totally crucial, because uploading yourself to a totally unconscious device is effectively suicide, right? But also, when we're thinking about the long-term continuation or extinction of the human race, human species, to be replaced by some successor form of machine intelligence, I think it's also important to us whether that successor form of machine intelligence is conscious or not, right? I mean, you know, if the human race dies out, that sucks for us, obviously, right? But, you know, if we're replaced by some higher form of intelligence with an even richer form of consciousness, you know, maybe it's not so bad, right? All species die out in the end, we've had our time, right? But if we're replaced by machines that are just totally unconscious, that seems much worse, right? Because now the richest, most complex form of consciousness in the solar system, in the universe as we know it, has been snuffed out and just been replaced by dead machines. Okay? Thanks very much.